Henry Walker hadn't expected to survive Normandy. He was 28 from Missouri, the son of a butcher, and barely 3 weeks into his first combat mission. By then, the gunfire didn't scare him anymore. It was the silence that followed. That heavy, unnatural stillness after a bombing run, when the world held its breath and the dead outnumbered the living. He had seen villages flattened, families gone, friends vanish in smoke, but he had never seen something like her. The orchard near Saint-Étienne was supposed to be cleared. At least, that's what command said. But war didn't follow maps. Henry had broken from his unit after a mortar landed too close, killing Sergeant Bell and sending the others scattering. That's when he found the girl under the broken cart. He didn't know her name. All he knew was that she wasn't supposed to be alive. And yet somehow, she was. The field manual didn't say what to do with dying civilians. He wasn't trained for this. His boots were covered in blood, not tears. He wasn't supposed to care, but he did. And with one whispered word, she made him care even more than he thought possible. Maman. That wasn't just a name. It was a plea, a reason to fight a different kind of battle. What followed was no longer a mission. It became a rescue, a silent war beneath the surface of the real one. And Henry would do things he never imagined just to get her out alive. If this kind of story moves you, subscribe to our channel for more powerful true and fictional tales from history's darkest hours. Comment where you're watching from, and let us know, what would you have done in Henry's place? Henry crawled across the broken stone wall, his palms slicing open against the rough edges, but he didn't stop. The smoke from the mortar blast still hung heavy in the air, thick and bitter, sticking to the back of his throat like ash. He could barely hear anything besides the ringing in his ears and the occasional crack of gunfire in the distance. The orchard that had once held the promise of fruit and shade now looked like a battlefield drawn straight from hell. Limbs, both human and wooden, littered the ground. Leaves smoldered like forgotten prayers, and amid the carnage he moved with one thought in his mind: stay low, stay quiet, stay alive. He had no idea where the rest of his squad was. They had scattered when the shell landed. Bell was definitely gone. He saw the body crumple like wet paper. Ramirez might have run toward the ridge, and Jones. He didn't want to think about Jones. Henry had landed hard when the blast tossed him, hitting his ribs against a stump that no longer looked like a tree. He wasn't sure how bad the damage was, only that each breath felt like punishment. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, boots sinking into soft dirt, red with blood that wasn't his, not yet. As he passed what was once a farmer's stone fence, he heard something strange, a sound that didn't belong. Not metal, not boots, not a scream. It was softer, rhythmic, almost like breathing. He stopped dead in his tracks, heart hammering so loud he swore it gave him away. Slowly, he crouched behind a pile of collapsed crates and held his breath. There it was again, low, weak, fragile. Someone was alive. Against every instinct, he turned toward it. The cart had been overturned in the blast, its wheels cracked, one of them spinning aimlessly. Underneath the rubble, barely visible through tangled canvas and bloodied hay, he saw her. A girl, small, face covered in soot and dried blood, clothes torn at the shoulder. Her chest rose and fell with irregular effort, like each breath was a decision she had to make. For a second, Henry thought she was already gone. Then her lips moved, forming a shape too quiet to hear. He stepped closer. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the sting in his ribs. "Hey," he whispered. No response. He reached for his canteen and carefully tilted it to her lips. A few drops touched her mouth, and her eyes fluttered open. Not fully, just enough to see him. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She simply stared. Then her lips parted, and she breathed one word. "Maman." Her voice was dry, cracked, but the meaning struck Henry like a bullet. He had sisters back home. One of them had a voice like that when she cried at night after their mother died. That same broken softness, that same absence behind the eyes. This girl, This stranger wasn't just injured, she was barely clinging to anything. And for some reason, she had survived what dozens around her hadn't. Henry knew the safe thing would be to walk away. His mission wasn't to save French civilians. It was to regroup, to kill, to obey. But now he couldn't move. The weight of her gaze pinned him in place. He looked around. No soldiers, no command, just the whisper of wind through dead trees and a girl who had no one. His heart battled his orders. Protocol told him to move on, but something older, deeper, told him that if he walked away now, he wouldn't survive this war anyway. Not inside. He bent down, cleared debris with shaking hands and tried to gently slide her free. She gasped in pain. "Sorry, sorry," he whispered. He knew he was making noise. He knew this could draw attention. But each time he looked at her face, it was like watching the last fragile light in a ruined cathedral. She weighed almost nothing. Skin like porcelain, streaked with dirt. Blood soaked into her dress and onto his uniform. Henry adjusted his grip and stood, the pain in his ribs flaring like fire. He bit his lip and kept moving. Each step felt like treason against his orders. But he remembered something Belle used to say before everything went to hell. Sometimes the right thing ain't in the book. Henry didn't know if this was right, but it felt human. The orchard gave way to a narrow trail, winding between fallen trees and bomb craters. He kept low, eyes scanning. Every sound, every creak of branches could mean death. Still, he pressed on. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep her alive. He whispered to her as they moved, nonsense words, the kind he remembered saying to his niece when she was scared of thunder. "It's okay. You're okay now. Just hold on." She didn't speak again. Her head rested against his chest, and every so often he checked to see if she was still breathing. Somehow she was, but he could feel her slipping, like a candle near the end of its wick. The sound of boots in the distance froze him. German. Close. Henry ducked behind a mound of rubble and curled around her, shielding her body with his own. He held his breath as shadows passed nearby, voices muttering in a language he didn't understand, but instinctively feared. The girl trembled once beneath him. He tightened his grip. A few seconds later, silence returned. But the war was far from quiet. The silence after the patrol passed was more terrifying than their boots. Henry didn't move for almost a minute, afraid they might double back. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, pounding like a drum against his skull. The girl shifted slightly in his arms, her breath coming in faint huffs. He couldn't wait any longer. They were exposed. Staying meant death. He lifted her again, muscles shaking, and continued down a narrow slope where overgrown brush offered some cover. He found an old storage cellar, half buried beneath vines and stone. The door had rotted, barely hanging on its hinges. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew, but it was better than open ground. He laid her gently on a bed of burlap sacks and cracked grain bags. She moaned softly, her face contorted in pain, and he whispered to her again, "Just a little longer. Just hang on." Her eyes opened barely and fixed on his. Then they closed again. Henry removed his jacket and covered her with it. She was cold, colder than he expected. He felt her forehead, fever. Her side was soaked in blood. He needed to stop the bleeding. From a pouch on his belt, he pulled a field bandage and pressed it to her wound, apologizing under his breath. She winced, but didn't cry out. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. But they were all each other had now. That thought terrified him. Outside, the sounds of war rose again, distant gunfire, a tank grinding across torn earth, muffled shouts. Henry crawled to the door and peeked out. No one in sight. His mind raced. He needed morphine, water, food, but his pack had only one canteen and a few rations. He couldn't leave her here alone, not in this state. But going for help meant risking his life and possibly getting caught. He clenched his jaw. He had made his choice back at the cart. Now he had to follow through. He tore a piece from his undershirt, soaked it with the last of his water, and cleaned the dirt off her face. She looked like a ghost, barely tethered to life. Then, finally, she stirred. Her voice was barely audible, a whisper carried on a broken breath. "Claire," she said. Henry leaned in. "Is that your name?" She blinked once. He nodded slowly. "Okay, Claire. You're gonna be all right." He wasn't sure if he was lying. He only knew he had to believe it. The hours crawled by. Claire drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time she awoke, Henry was there, speaking softly, tending the bandage. He hummed songs from home, fragments of lullabies his mother used to sing when storms kept him up at night. She seemed to calm at the sound of his voice, even when words failed them both. He no longer thought of her as a civilian, not a stranger. She was someone under his protection now, and nothing else mattered. By dusk, Henry knew he had to move. He'd heard voices nearby, English this time, his unit maybe. If they found him harboring a civilian girl without permission, they might call it insubordination. But she wouldn't last the night without proper care. He had no stretcher, no radio, no flares, just his arms and the will to carry her again. He looked down at Claire. Her lips were blue. If she died here, it would be as if she never existed at all. He made a decision. He tucked her tighter in the jacket, whispered that he'd be back, and crawled from the cellar like a shadow. Every movement was pain. His ribs screamed, his legs ached, but he kept moving, low and fast. He reached the ridge just as the last light of day kissed the treetops. Then he saw them, his squad, Ramirez, Thompson, even Jones, alive after all. Relief surged through him. He stood and waved. "Walker!" they shouted. "We thought you were dead." They welcomed him back with disbelief and slaps on the back. But Henry didn't waste time. "There's a girl," he said, "wounded. She needs help." The others exchanged glances. "A civilian?" Thompson asked. Henry nodded. "She's just a kid, maybe 15. I couldn't leave her." The sergeant narrowed his eyes. "We're not here to play nurse, Walker. You disobeyed direct orders." Henry's fists clenched. "I made a call. She's still breathing, but not for long." There was a long pause. Then Ramirez stepped forward. "Where is she?" Ramirez didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his gear, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and nodded at Henry. "Lead the way," he said. Henry didn't hesitate. Together they slipped away from the others, ignoring the tension in the sergeant's voice behind them. They moved fast and low, weaving through scorched hedgerows and over craters still warm from shellfire. Night had fallen hard, and only the red flicker of distant fires lit their path. Henry's heart pounded, not just from exertion, but from fear she wouldn't still be breathing when they arrived. The way back to the cellar felt longer in the dark. Every branch, snap, and gust of wind sounded like enemy boots. Ramirez covered the rear, whispering soft prayers in Spanish. Henry said nothing, only replayed Claire's pale face over and over in his mind. When they reached the ruined farmhouse, he sprinted ahead and dropped to the cellar entrance. "Claire," he whispered. Silence. "Claire, I'm back." He pushed the door open and climbed down, his voice trembling. Then from the shadows, a faint cough. She was alive. Barely. Henry rushed to her, lifting her gently. Ramirez followed and lit a small torch. His face changed when he saw her. "Madre de Dios," he muttered. "She's just a child." Claire opened her eyes and tried to speak, but her lips barely moved. Henry held her tighter. "We're getting you out." Ramirez scanned the wound. "She needs a medic. Now. This is bad." Henry nodded. "Help me carry her." Together they formed a sling with their arms and blankets. Then they moved. Outside, the sky glowed orange as artillery lit up the northern ridge. They had to avoid the main path. It was exposed and likely mined. Ramirez took the lead now, guiding them through a trench line long abandoned. Mud clung to their boots, and the smell of rot hung thick in the air. Claire drifted in and out, her fingers clutching Henry's sleeve when she was awake. "Maman," she whispered again, softer now. Henry whispered back, "We're going to find her, I promise." Halfway through the field, they heard it, a whistle followed by the screeching descent of a mortar. "Down!" Ramirez shouted. They dove behind a ridge as the explosion shook the earth. Dirt rained down on them. Claire cried out, a sound like tearing paper. Henry checked her quickly. Still breathing, they couldn't stop. With lungs burning and nerves raw, they pushed forward. Every second mattered. Somewhere ahead was a command post. If they could just reach it, maybe she had a chance. They reached the outskirts of the unit's new position by midnight. A medic tent glowed faintly in the dark like a sanctuary. Guards stopped them, rifles raised. "She's a civilian," one shouted. "This is a combat zone." Henry didn't slow. "She's dying," he yelled. Ramirez held up his dog tags. "We need a medic!" A young corporal ran to them, eyes wide. He shouted inside the tent. Moments later, 2 medics appeared and took Claire from their arms, placing her on a stretcher. Henry nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Inside the tent, the scene was chaos. Soldiers groaning, blood pooling, medics moving like ghosts in the low light. Henry and Ramirez watched as Claire was cleaned, her wound wrapped, fluids pushed into her arm. A nurse looked up. "She's septic, but she might pull through if the fever drops." Henry stood frozen, covered in dirt and blood. Ramirez rested a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, hermano." But Henry didn't feel heroic. He felt empty, like he'd gambled with death and barely won. A lieutenant entered and pulled them aside. "You left your position. That's desertion." Henry opened his mouth, but Ramirez cut in. Permission was not given, but it was needed. She would have died. The lieutenant eyed them coldly, then looked at Claire. Something changed in his face. He sighed. "There's no room for saints in war. But sometimes we need one anyway." He turned away. "Get some rest. Both of you. I didn't see anything." Henry exhaled for the first time in hours. Outside, the cold air hit harder than before. The stars above them blinked faintly through the smoke. Ramirez lit a cigarette and passed one to Henry. "So what now?" Henry asked, voice hoarse. Ramirez shrugged. "Now, we wait, and hope that doing the right thing still counts for something." Henry nodded, staring at the tent. Claire was alive, but only just. The war was far from over, but for one night, one moment, he had fought for something beyond orders. He had fought for life. The fever broke just before dawn, and with it came a voice Henry had only heard in fragments. Claire's eyes opened, clearer now, searching the medic tent like a traveler waking on the wrong shore. Henry leaned close. Ramirez hovered at the foot of the cot, hat in his hands. Outside, generators coughed and the war sharpened its teeth for another day. Claire swallowed, winced, then touched her collarbone, tapping twice. "Necklace," she whispered, in accented English that surprised them both. Henry followed her finger and found a thin chain buried beneath the bandage. It wasn't jewelry meant for beauty. It was built like a habit, worn, stubborn, private. The locket was oval, dented, warm from her skin, closed with a tiny, clever hinge. Henry pried gently with his thumbnail until the clasp yielded like a held breath. Inside was no picture, no lock of hair, no saint's icon. Just 2 curls of translucent film folded to fit a space meant for love. Ramirez's eyes widened. He whistled low. "Microfilm," he said, and the tent suddenly felt smaller. A medic noticed the open locket and stiffened, his gaze snapping to Henry. "Whatever that is, it goes to intelligence," he warned, already reaching for it. Claire's hand shot up startlingly fast, catching Henry's wrist instead. Her grip was weak but iron with purpose. Her eyes burned. "Please," she breathed, "to Maman. Only her." Henry glanced at Ramirez, then at the medic, then back to Claire. "Who is Maman?" he asked, voice low as a prayer. Claire's answer came in halting pieces, stitched by pain and will. "Maman is not my mother," she said, and a shadow crossed her face. "She is the one who feeds the night and starves the wolf." Ramirez frowned, translating the poetry into war. "Resistance handler," he muttered. "Code name, Maman?" Claire nodded, tears bright as glass. She waits in Saint-Étienne, at the bell that doesn't ring. Henry felt the ground tilt under him, the orchard spinning back into view. The name hadn't been a cry for comfort. It was a direction masked as a prayer. He folded the locket shut, the click loud as a shot in the cramped tent. Intelligence would come, and then MPs, and then questions with hard edges. Orders would unravel mercy. Mercy would bend orders until something broke. Ramirez scratched his jaw, already reading Henry's face. "Whatever we do fast," he said. They didn't have time to choose. The war chose for them. A siren wailed outside, and the canvas walls shook with the concussion of guns. A runner threw the tent flap open and yelled, "Counter-attack on the eastern hedgerow." Medics began moving stretchers, the tent filling with the wet thunder of panic. In the churn, the young corporal from last night spotted Henry. "Lieutenant wants you on line 2 now," he barked. Henry's eyes flicked back to Claire, then to the locket in his palm. Duty tugged one arm, promise tugged the other, and he stood between them like a wishbone. Claire watched him, reading the break before it happened. She reached for his sleeve, the gesture small and shattering. "If you give it to the wrong mouth," she said, "good men die in secret." Ramirez stepped into the gap, calm and steady as a held lantern. "I'll take the line," he told Henry. "You take the girl's truth." The choice detonated inside Henry, and when the smoke cleared, he nodded. They needed proof the film mattered more than the moment. Henry cupped the locket, raised it toward the lantern, and squinted through the seam. On the film's shadowed veins, he saw grid squares, bridge markings, and a river's black spine. German emplacements annotated in a tight, neat hand, the kind that never shakes. One symbol repeated, a little cross under a bell. Ramirez's mouth tightened. "Artillery coordinates and a rendezvous mark. Saint-Étienne, the silent bell," Henry said, feeling the map stitched to the word. Orders and consequences crashed together like surf. If he went to intel, Claire would vanish into locked rooms and altered reports. If he defied the chain, he'd trade stripes he didn't have for prison he didn't want. But the orchard's ghost pressed a cold hand to his spine. Sometimes the right thing ain't in the book. He slid the locket on its chain back around Claire's neck, tucking it beneath the bandage. "Can you walk?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She tried to sit. Pain folded her cleanly in half. Henry caught her, and the decision hardened into steel. "We move when the guns speak loudest," he said. "Noise is a bridge." He looked to Ramirez, who pulled a rosary from his pocket and kissed the worn crucifix. "Go," Ramirez said, eyes bright with something between fear and faith. "I'll tell the lieutenant you're fetching wire cutters and never came back." Their hands clasped once, soldiers binding a lie to a promise. Outside, the sky flared white, then orange, then a deep, murderous red. Henry wrapped Claire in a blanket and slung her across his shoulders fireman style. Every step lit a fuse in his ribs. The world narrowed to breath and weight. They slipped through the back seam of canvas while the tent hemorrhaged chaos. Rain began in a fine conspiratorial mist, quieting the dust and swallowing their tracks. Claire's breath warmed his neck. The locket's edge pressed through the blanket like a secret tooth. They disappeared into hedgerows that remembered every war that had ever passed. The path to Saint-Étienne was a frayed thread through fields gnawed by steel. Henry followed the river cut, skirting the glinting eyes of water-filled craters. Twice, German voices drifted across the reeds, and twice he went still as stone. Claire's fingers clutched his sleeve in the pauses, a rhythm between terror and trust. A farmhouse loomed, its roof bowed like a tired back. He veered wide. An owl lifted from a fence post, wings whispering them onward. The bell tower finally showed, dark, mute, a finger raised to its lips. They reached the church square as the bombardment throbbed behind them like a second heart. Henry set Claire down on the steps and scanned the dark. No resistance scouts, no passwords exchanged, just wet stone and the faint echo of war. He reached for the door. It gave with a sigh that sounded almost relieved. Inside, candles slept in their brass beds, unlit and patient. Claire pointed to the side chapel, to a confessional whose curtain was pinned shut by a nail. "The bell that doesn't ring," she whispered. "We ring it differently." Henry eased the nail free and drew the curtain, the hush thick enough to drink. On the shelf lay a single taper and a matchbook stamped with a cafe's name. He struck a match. Sulphur bloomed, and shadow retreated an inch. Behind the lace of the confessional screen, a face appeared, lined and fierce. A woman in her 50s, hair hidden under a kerchief, eyes like flint under rain. "Maman," Claire breathed, and not as a code this time, but as a found harbor. The woman pushed the screen aside, stepped out, and looked Henry up and down. "You brought her," Maman said, voice a blade wrapped in velvet, "and with her, trouble you cannot yet count." Henry swallowed and lifted the chain from Claire's collarbone with respectful hands. Maman took the locket without touching his fingers, as if the metal itself was sworn. She opened it, glanced once, and shut it fast, the decision already made behind her eyes. "Tonight, the bridge at Vaucluse falls," she said, "and perhaps with it, many boys you call enemies." She looked at Henry again. "And perhaps some of yours, if we are too late." Boots scraped stone outside, one pair, then two, then a triangulated three. The church door shivered, tested by a curious palm in the dark. Maman slid a concealed panel in the wainscoting with a practiced thumb. "Down," she ordered. "The sacristy tunnel. It was old when my grandmother was not." Henry lifted Claire again, and Maman pressed a small revolver into his free hand. "For the man who will not listen," she said simply. The door creaked. Voices entered. The bell that didn't ring stayed mercifully silent. The tunnel breathed cold on their faces, as if the earth itself were steadying them. Henry moved first, Claire in his arms, Maman close behind with the locket hidden again. Old stones sweated. Trickles of water stitched the silence with thin silver threads. Above, Boots prowled the nave, cautious, curious, hungry for noise. Henry counted steps, breaths, the small tremors of Claire's fingers on his sleeve. "Left at the cistern," Maman whispered, voice threaded with years of practice. "The passage forks. The right path dies with the revolution." They reached the cistern, a black coin sunk in the floor, and turned left. The ceiling lowered, forcing Henry's shoulders to bow around Claire like a shield. Ram's horn roots veined the mortar. A pale mushroom broke under his boot with a sigh. Behind them, a door thumped, searchers finding the sacristy, smelling the old wood. Maman touched Henry's elbow, warning and blessing in one brief press. "Another 2 minutes," she said. "Then we breathe war again." Claire murmured, "Maman," once more. But now it meant 2 women. The passage ended at an iron grate, furred with rust and stubborn history. Maman produced a wire-wrapped key, its teeth filed into a rumor of law. The lock resisted like a clenched jaw, then yielded with a damp exhale. They climbed into a coal shed stacked with sacks and the ghost of labor. Outside, rain stitched the dark lanes of Saint-Étienne into secret threads. Maman cracked the door, scanned and nodded once. "Follow, but walk like you belong," she said. "Guilt has a smell." They crossed the square, 3 shadows practicing the art of being furniture. A patrol passed, heads down against the weather, rifles slung like weary habits. A dog barked from a doorway. Maman tossed it a crust from her pocket. It took the bribe, ethics suspended for the night's small mercies. They slipped into a back alley ribboned with laundry that would never quite dry. A bicycle leaned under a gutter. Maman tested the chain with a mechanic's ear. "Bridge first," she said, "then choices." Ramirez was waiting where Henry had only hoped, beneath a clipped yew by the cemetery wall. His helmet was gone. His eyes were lit by the kind of relief that hurts. "You owe me 6 wire cutters," he said, then saw Claire and Maman and fell quiet. Sirens braided the distance. The eastern hedgerow spat light into the clouds. "I told them you went for comms. They believed me because they wanted to." He glanced at Maman's steady face and nodded respect. "Tell me where to stand so I don't get saints killed." Maman drew in the mud with a stick, lines like veins on God's wrist. "The bridge at Vaucluse," she said. "Charges are set by fools, timing by optimists. The microfilm fixes the schedule and the guard rotations." She tapped a notch. "Here, the pilings are old wood wrapped in new lies. Cut here, burn here, and the river writes our alibi." Ramirez grinned without humor. "I always liked collaborative art." Henry only said, "How long?" "Before dawn breaks the rifles awake," Maman said. 20 minutes to place, 5 to pray." "And you?" Henry asked. "Claire?" Maman's jaw set. "I take her to the apothecary cellar. He owes me 3 lives." A beat of rain thickened, the world drawing its hood lower. Henry touched Claire's hair, felt her heat slipping back toward normal. "Live," he whispered, and she blinked slow, as if signing a treaty. Then the night moved them like chess. They split, Maman and Claire toward the river lane's humbler shadows, Henry and Ramirez knifing through hedges that smelled of rain and cordite. The bridge came on like a low hymn, its arches dark ribs over a coughing river. 2 sentries smoked under a tin awning, faces cupped from the rain by their own hands. Ramirez tapped Henry's shoulder, counting beats, measuring carelessness. On 3, they slid under the lip of the stonework, river slick and muscle tight. The water licked their boots, a cold oath. Charges waited in oilskin like patient wolves. Henry's hands worked the primer caps, while Ramirez watched the cadence of cigarettes. One guard laughed, the other shivered, stamping a foot, making a rhythm Henry used. He fixed the first charge to the wrapped piling, the second to a seam like a scar. Between them, he ran the pre-cut cord, blessing each knot by habit. A flare flowered far off, red and brief and meaningless here. They moved to the final brace, the one that would persuade stone to remember water. A cough behind them. Not the river. Boots. A flashlight combed the underbelly, light cutting their dark to ribbons. "Hello!" a voice called, suspicion already stepping forward. Ramirez's fingers closed around Henry's sleeve. Stillness, then violence. The beam found a glint of oilskin, paused, began to climb toward faces. Ramirez surged, a silent tackle that turned the light into a drowning star. They hit the shallows hard. Breath and curses boiled the surface. Henry was on the guard's arm, wrenching the wrist until the pistol spat into the river. The man thrashed. Ramirez clamped a hand over his mouth. Mercy measured to seconds. Bubbles climbed like confessions. The second sentry shouted from the awning, footsteps sliding. "Now!" Henry hissed, and Ramirez drove the man under, praying fast and ugly. The second sentry's shadow reached the rail. Henry planted the plunger and ran cord. 3 breaths, Ramirez gasped, water and regret in equal parts. 2, Henry said, and they vanished into the ribs of the bridge. They surfaced on the far bank, lungs lit with fire, hands shaking open like new birds. Screams crossed the water, questions pitched into the rain with no good ears to catch them. Henry looked at Ramirez, who looked back like a man memorizing a last page. "Light it," Ramirez said. Henry thumbed the striker. Sparks agreed with destiny. He touched flame to the line and felt the night lean in. "Run," he said, and the river counted for them. The explosion didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like wood remembering it was mortal. A white pulse, then a roar, then the groan of architecture unlearning itself. The center span folded delicately, almost polite, then smacked the water with a century's anger. Spray leapt, stones fell, voices scattered into smaller, lonelier shapes. Henry and Ramirez hit the mud, covered their heads, tasted grit and relief. The rain took the smoke and made it a rumor. Somewhere, a bell did not ring, and that was the loudest sound of all. They found Maman at the apothecary's back steps, a triangle of candlelight at her feet. Claire lay on a pallet, color honest in her cheeks for the first time. Maman studied Henry like a ledger that balanced at last. "The river accepted your letter," she said. "It will carry it far." Ramirez leaned against the doorframe, every muscle asking for tomorrow. "Now what?" he asked, a soldier who had run out of names for after. Now we survive the paperwork, Maman said. Dawn came grey and careful over Saint-Étienne, revealing damage and decisions. Henry stood in the alley, watching light try its luck on wet stone. Footsteps approached, American, then stopped. The lieutenant from the medic tent emerged. He looked from the broken bridge smoke to Henry's mud-striped face, to Claire asleep. His mouth thinned into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I should arrest you," he said, as if testing a tooth. "Instead, I'll say I requisitioned a bicycle and lost track of it." Ramirez snorted. Maman didn't. "War needs liars with good timing," she said. The lieutenant nodded once, eyes weary, but not empty. "Intel wants the girl," he added, glancing toward Claire. "They'll be here in an hour." Maman's gaze sharpened. Henry felt the word "no" stiffen his spine. The officer raised a hand. "And I will tell them she was evacuated ahead of the line." He turned away, then stopped. "Tell her, whoever she is, that the bridge was an accident." He left the alley carrying a secret heavier than his sidearm. Claire woke to the smell of mint and vinegar, to Henry's shadow and Maman's hand. She touched the locket, then Henry's knuckles as if confirming a chain of custody. "Did we?" she asked, voice stitched with sleep and ash. Henry nodded, thinking of water swallowing decisions and spitting out chances. "You whispered one word," he said. "I followed it to a door." Maman's eyes softened. Ramirez pretended to check his bootlaces. Outside, church swallows wrote their small, fast sentences in the new light. They left Saint-Étienne by noon, 2 soldiers attached to a column that suddenly had room, one woman with a kerchief who knew more than she said, and a girl who had survived a map. At the ridge, Henry looked back and saw the bell tower, a dark finger still silent. He imagined it ringing once, years from now, for a wedding, a harvest, a promise kept. Ramirez bumped his shoulder. "You did the wrong thing beautifully," he said. Henry breathed, ribs aching, heart steady, hands finally empty. "Sometimes," he answered, "that's the only way it works." War had a way of erasing faces, names, and even whole towns, but Saint-Étienne stayed with Henry like a scar he didn't want to fade. Months later, long after the bridge's splinters had sunk into the riverbed and the front had moved east, he would still hear that single whispered word, "Maman," cutting through the chaos. It wasn't just the sound of a girl calling for safety. It was a reminder that, in the middle of orders and objectives, there were lives that could still be saved. Claire lived. Henry never learned where Maman took her after the apothecary cellar, and maybe that was better. Some stories were meant to stay hidden, stitched into the fabric of survival rather than paraded in medals and reports. But whenever he closed his eyes at night, he saw the silent bell tower, the locket's cold weight, and the moment he decided to carry her instead of walking away. The war would take much more from him before it ended, but it never took that choice. And in a world where survival often meant turning away, Henry Walker could live with the cost of having done the opposite. Somewhere, he liked to believe, the bell that didn't ring had finally found its voice.